Texas Panhandle, January 1945. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees overnight. A cold front sweeping down from Canada, with wind that cut through fabric like broken glass. 32 German women stood in formation outside the barracks at Camp Swift, their thin prison-issue coats inadequate against the freeze. One woman, Helene Richter, 24, from Berlin, shook so violently her teeth chattered loud enough to hear across the yard. Then Jack Morrison, a 56-year-old ranch hand serving as a civilian guard, removed his sheepskin jacket and draped it across her shoulders. The camp stopped breathing. Nobody moved. And in that silence, something fundamental shifted. The cold front arrived without warning. Texas weather could shift from mild to harsh within hours. And January 1945 brought one of those shifts that caught everyone unprepared. The temperature plummeted overnight, dropping from 45 degrees at sunset to 12 degrees by dawn. Wind howled across the flat prairie, finding every gap in walls and windows, turning the prison camp into a collection of inadequate shelters against weather that belonged further north. Camp Swift sat 15 miles outside Lubbock, established in 1943 to house German prisoners captured in North Africa and Italy. Most prisoners were men, housed in separate compounds, but one section held 32 women auxiliary personnel who'd worked as clerks, telephone operators, and nurses for the regime before capture. They'd been transported to Texas in November 1944, assigned to work programs involving laundry, food preparation, and clerical tasks that freed American personnel for other duties. The women's barracks was a wooden structure built quickly and cheaply, designed more for Texas heat and for unusual cold. Single-pane windows, gaps in the floorboards where wind whistled through. A wood stove in the center that provided some warmth, but couldn't compete with temperatures this low and wind this persistent. Helene Richter had spent the night huddled under 2 thin blankets, wearing every piece of clothing she owned: a prison-issue dress, a cardigan that had belonged to someone else, stockings with holes at the heels. She'd barely slept, the cold seeping into her bones until she felt like ice might be forming in her blood. She was from Berlin, had worked as a secretary in a shipping office before being conscripted for telephone duty in 1943. She'd surrendered to American forces in April 1944 during the chaos of the Italian campaign, had spent 6 months in detention facilities on the East Coast before being transported west to Texas. She'd expected many things in captivity: hard work, sparse rations, perhaps mistreatment. She hadn't expected to freeze to death in a place that propaganda had depicted as perpetually warm. At 6 a.m., the wake-up bell rang. Helene forced herself from the cot, her muscles stiff from shivering all night. Around her, 31 other women were rising with the same reluctance, breath visible in the cold air, faces pinched from insufficient sleep. They dressed quickly, not for warmth, because the clothes provided little, but because regulations required formation at 6:15. The women filed outside into wind that felt like punishment, lining up in 4 rows facing the guard station where American personnel conducted morning roll call. The prison-issue coats they'd been given were thin cotton, designed for moderate weather, adequate for Texas autumn and spring, useless against this cold. Helene wrapped her arms around herself, but it provided no relief. The wind found every gap in fabric, pressed cold against skin until she felt like she might shatter if touched. The other women were equally miserable. Anna Becker, standing beside Helene, had tears freezing on her cheeks, not from crying, but from wind making her eyes water. Marguerite Fisher's lips were turning blue. Greta Vogel couldn't stop shaking, her whole body trembling with cold that had nowhere to go. The American guards emerged from the guard station, 3 men responsible for overseeing the women's compound. Lieutenant Hayes was the officer in charge, a career military man who ran the compound by regulations and rarely showed emotion. Corporal Davis was younger, drafted from somewhere in the South, efficient but distant. And then there was Jack Morrison. Morrison was different from the military personnel. He was a civilian contractor, hired as a guard because men his age were needed stateside when younger men went overseas. He was 56, had worked ranches around Lubbock his entire life, knew cattle and horses better than he knew military protocol. He'd taken the guard job for the pay, but he treated it like ranch work necessary tasks performed with practical efficiency rather than ideological commitment. He emerged from the guard station wearing a sheepskin jacket that he de-owned for 20 years, leather on the outside, wool on the inside, the kind of coat that could keep a man warm through winter nights checking on cattle during storms. He was also wearing gloves, a hat with ear flaps, and boots lined with wool. The contrast was immediate and stark. The guards were dressed for the weather. The prisoners were dressed for survival that was barely adequate. Lieutenant Hayes began roll call, reading names from a clipboard, while Corporal Davis checked off responses. The wind made it difficult to hear, so Hayes had to repeat several names. The women answered in sequence, voices tight from cold, bodies shaking visibly. Helene's turn came. Richter, Helene. She tried to respond, but her jaw was shaking so hard she couldn't form words clearly. Present, she managed, the word barely audible over the wind. Hayes looked up from his clipboard, noticing for the first time how severely the cold was affecting the prisoners. He was a by-the-book officer, not naturally cruel, but also not inclined toward sentiment. The regulations said prisoners received adequate clothing. If the clothing proved inadequate during unusual weather, that wasn't his responsibility to solve immediately. He continued roll call. When finished, he addressed the group. Work assignments remain unchanged. Kitchen detail reports to the mess hall. Laundry detail to the wash facility. Clerical workers to the administration building. Dismissed. The women began moving toward their assignments, but several were struggling. Helene took a step and her legs nearly gave out, muscles stiff from shivering. Anna caught her arm, steadying her. They moved together toward the administration building where Helene worked filing paperwork, a task that at least occurred indoors where some heat existed. That's when Jack Morrison stepped forward. He moved without hesitation, crossing the distance between the guard station and where Helene stood in 3 long strides. He reached her just as she was about to take another step, and without saying anything, he removed his sheepskin jacket. The motion was fluid, practiced the movement of a man who'd removed a coat 1,000 times to help someone carry something, to throw over a horse's back, to use as a pillow during long nights on the range. He held it for a moment, the jacket heavy with wool and leather and the warmth of his body, and then he draped it across Helene's shoulders. The jacket was enormous on her. It hung to her knees, the sleeves extending past her hands. But it was warm incredibly, impossibly warm. Helene felt heat radiating from the wool lining, felt wind stop cutting through fabric, felt something inside her that had been clenched tight begin to relax. The camp went silent. Lieutenant Hayes stopped mid-sentence in whatever he'd been saying to Corporal Davis. The other women froze in place, watching. The few male guards visible from the adjacent compound turned to look. Even the wind seemed to pause for a breath, the howling dropping to a whisper. No one spoke, no one moved. The moment stretched, suspended in the cold morning air like something tangible that could be touched. Helene looked up at Morrison. He was a big man, over 6 feet, with weathered skin from decades of outdoor work and eyes that were clear gray, the color of winter sky. He met her gaze without errant discomfort, without the hatred she'd been taught to expect from Americans, without the contempt that guards sometimes showed prisoners. "You're freezing," he said simply. His voice carried a West Texas drawl, words spaced out like fence posts. "Can't work if you're frozen solid." Helene's English was limited, but she understood the meaning, if not every word. She wanted to thank him, to express gratitude for this unexpected kindness, but her throat was tight with emotion that had nothing to do with cold. She nodded instead, pulling the jacket closer around her shoulders. Morrison stepped back, now wearing only a flannel shirt against the wind. He didn't seem bothered by the cold, or if he was, he didn't show it. He returned to his position near the guard station as if nothing unusual had occurred. Lieutenant Hayes found his voice. "Morrison, you can't give your jacket to a prisoner. That's—" He paused, searching for the regulation that covered this situation, and apparently finding none. "That's inappropriate." Morrison met his gaze steadily. "Lieutenant, that woman's lips were turning blue. She's no good to anyone frozen. I'll get my jacket back when the temperature rises. Until then, she needs it more than I do." The logic was practical, undeniable. Hayes opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He looked at Helene standing in Morrison's oversized jacket, at the other women who were watching with expressions mixing hope and disbelief, at Morrison who stood in just a flannel shirt, acting like giving his coat to an enemy prisoner was the most natural thing in the world. Finally, Hayes nodded. "Fine, but the jacket gets returned by end of day." Morrison nodded. "Fair enough." The silence broke. The camp resumed movement, women heading to work assignments, guards returning to duties. But something had fundamentally shifted, like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that would spread outward in ways no one could predict. Helene walked to the administration building, wearing Morrison's jacket. Anna beside her, neither speaking. The jacket's warmth was almost overwhelming after hours of cold. She could feel her body slowly relaxing, muscles unclenching, blood moving more freely through extremities that had been numb. Inside the administration building, heat from a coal furnace provided adequate warmth. Helene should have removed the jacket, should have set it aside while she worked, at her desk filing paperwork and typing forms on an ancient typewriter. But she couldn't bring herself to take it off. The warmth felt like safety, like kindness she hadn't experienced since before capture, like proof that not all Americans were the enemies propaganda had depicted. The other women, assigned to clerical work, gathered around her during the morning break. They spoke in quick German, voices hushed even though the American supervisor didn't understand their language. "Did you see what he did?" Marguerite asked. "Just gave you his jacket without thinking." Anna touched the jacket's sleeve. "This is real sheepskin. Expensive. Not something you give away lightly." Greta was more cautious. "It's a trick. Americans trying to make us compliant by showing false kindness. The regime warned us about this." But Helene shook her head. "I don't think it was calculated. It looked automatic, like he saw someone cold and reacted without thinking about politics or war." A conversation continued through the morning, the women trying to interpret Morrison's gesture through frameworks that made sense propaganda warnings about American manipulation, alternative theories about strategic kindness, or the possibility that it was simply what it appeared to be, a man showing compassion to another human being who was suffering. Morrison had been born in 1889, had grown up on ranches during an era when Texas was still transitioning from frontier to settled territory. He'd learned to work cattle and horses from his father, had spent decades doing hard physical labor under sun and wind that aged a man faster than time alone. He'd married at 23, had 2 sons by the time he was 30. His wife, Mary, had died from influenza in 1932, one of the late casualties of a pandemic that had taken millions. His sons had both enlisted after Pearl Harbor. One was serving in the Pacific, the other in Europe. Morrison didn't know exactly where. The letters were censored, the details vague. He'd taken the guard job at Camp Swift because ranching work had declined as younger men went to war. The pay was decent, the work was stable, and it kept him busy during months when he'd otherwise be alone on a ranch with 2. Much time to think about sons in danger and a wife who'd been gone too long. He didn't hate Germans. Hatred required emotional investment he didn't have capacity for anymore. These women prisoners were just people caught in circumstances beyond their control, same as his sons were caught in circumstances beyond theirs. Treating them with basic decency seemed like the minimum standard of civilized behavior. When he saw Helene shaking from cold that morning, genuinely in danger of hypothermia, lips turning blue, body failing to generate enough heat, his response was automatic. You helped someone who was suffering if you could. That was how he'd been raised, how he'd lived, how he tried to act regardless of circumstances. The fact that helping meant giving his jacket to an enemy prisoner barely registered as relevant. She was cold. He had warmth to share. The equation was simple. By afternoon, word of Morrison's gesture had spread throughout Camp Swift. Prisoners talked to prisoners. Guards talked to guards. The story traveled across compound boundaries, growing slightly in the telling, but maintaining its essential truth. Civilian guard had given his expensive sheepskin jacket to a freezing German woman prisoner during morning formation. Reactions varied. Some guards thought Morrison had been foolish, that showing kindness to prisoners set a dangerous precedent. Others saw it as simple human decency that reflected well on American values. Prisoners interpreted it through their own frameworks, some suspicious, some hopeful, all surprised. Lieutenant Hayes called Morrison into his office at 2 p.m. The office was small, heated by a radiator that clanked periodically, with a window overlooking the women's compound. Hayes sat behind a desk covered with paperwork and regulations manuals. Morrison, Hayes began, his tone careful. What you did this morning was ... unusual. I need to understand your thinking. Morrison removed his hat, holding it in work-worn hands. Lieutenant, that woman was freezing. Looked like she might collapse. I had a warm jacket. Seemed straightforward. Hayes leaned back in his chair. These are enemy prisoners. We're supposed to maintain professional distance. Providing them with necessities is one thing, but giving them personal items creates problems? Morrison interrupted. What problems? She's warmer. She can work better. She's not at risk of hypothermia. Seems like it solves problems. Hayes was quiet for a moment. You don't think this could be interpreted as fraternization? As showing favoritism? Morrison met his gaze. I'd have done the same for any of those women if they'd been in the same state. This wasn't about picking favorites. It was about preventing suffering when I had the means to prevent it. Hayes sighed. He was a military officer, trained to follow regulations. But he also spent 3 years of war, learning that regulations sometimes failed to address actual situations requiring human judgment. All right, he said finally. But the jacket comes back tonight. And if other prisoners need cold weather clothing, we address it through proper supply channels, not through personal charity. Morrison nodded. Understood, sir. At 6 p.m., workday ended. The women returned to their barracks as evening shadows stretched across the compound. Helene had worn Morrison's jacket all day, removing it only when indoors in heated spaces, putting it back on whenever she went outside. The jacket had become a kind of talisman proof that kindness could exist even in circumstances defined by enmity. She knew she had to return it. Lieutenant Hayes had been clear, and Morrison had lent it, not given it. But she was reluctant to let it go, reluctant to return to the thin cotton coat that provided so little protection. Anna walked with her to the guard station where Morrison was ending his shift. He saw them approaching and nodded, as if expecting this. Helene removed the jacket slowly, the evening air immediately pressing cold against her shoulders, despite being less harsh than the morning had been. She held the jacket for a moment, struggling to find English words adequate to express what she felt. Thank you, she managed. Her accent was thick, the words halting. Very kind, very. She searched for the word. Warm. Morrison took the jacket, his expression unchanged. You're welcome. Stay warm as you can. He turned to go, but Helene spoke again. Why? In broken English, mixed with German that Morrison likely couldn't understand. She asked why he'd helped her, why he'd shown kindness to an enemy. Morrison paused. He seemed to consider whether to answer, whether there was a way to explain across language barriers and cultural divides. Finally, he spoke slowly, spacing words so she might understand. Because you were cold, and I could help. Doesn't need to be more complicated than that. He left then, walking toward the civilian quarters where he stayed during his duty rotation. Helene stood with Anna, watching him go, still feeling phantom warmth where the jacket had been. That evening in the barracks, the women gathered around the wood stove, talking about what had happened. The topic dominated conversation Morrison's gesture, its meaning, its implications. Marguerite, who'd maintained some loyalty to the regime, despite evidence of its falsehoods, struggled with the cognitive dissonance. We were told Americans would treat us harshly, that they saw us as inferior, as enemies deserving punishment. But that man gave his jacket without hesitation. Anna, more pragmatic, said what many were thinking. Maybe we were lied to about many things. If they lied about American treatment of prisoners, what else was false? The question hung in the cold air. These women had been shaped by propaganda that depicted Americans as cruel, racially divided, industrially weak a nation that would collapse under the weight of sustained warfare. But nothing they'd experienced in captivity matched those depictions. They'd been fed adequately, housed in facilities that were basic but functional, paid small wages for their work, allowed to send and receive letters. And now, a civilian guard had given an expensive jacket to a freezing prisoner without apparent calculation or expectation of return. The contradictions accumulated until propaganda's hold weakened, until the official narratives couldn't withstand contact with reality. Helene wrote in a journal that evening, a small notebook she'd been keeping since capture, writing in German despite knowing that guards periodically inspected personal items for security purposes. She wrote about the cold, about Morrison's gesture, about the confusion of being treated with unexpected kindness by those she'd been taught to hate. January 15th, 1945. Today, a guard named Morrison gave me his jacket because I was freezing. He didn't ask permission. He didn't make a show of it. He just saw someone suffering and helped. I don't know how to reconcile this with everything I believed about Americans. But I know that I've been cold my entire life since capture, and for one day I was warm because an enemy chose compassion over cruelty. That has to mean something. The temperature rose overnight, the cold front moving east and taking the brutal cold with it. By morning, the thermometer read 38 degrees, still cool but manageable with the clothing they had. Morning formation proceeded normally, though several women glanced toward Morrison when he emerged from the guard station, now wearing his sheepskin jacket again. He didn't acknowledge the attention. He simply stood at his post, watching the roll call proceed, treating this morning like any other. But something had changed in how the prisoners looked at him, in how they understood their relationship with their captors. Over the following weeks, small interactions between Morrison and the women prisoners developed. He learned a few German words, simple greetings, basic commands. The women improved their English through daily exposure. Morrison would comment on the weather, ask if anyone was sick, ensure work assignments weren't exceeding reasonable limits. It wasn't friendship, the circumstances prevented that. But it was mutual recognition of shared humanity, acknowledgement that enemy status didn't erase the basic obligations people owed each other. Lieutenant Hayes noticed the shift, but chose not to intervene. The women's compound ran smoothly. Work was completed efficiently. Discipline problems were minimal. Whatever effect Morrison's gesture had created, it seemed to make his job easier rather than harder. By February, mail service had become more reliable. Letters from Germany took 6 to 8 weeks to arrive, but they arrived with increasing frequency as military postal systems adapted to handling prisoner correspondence. Helene received a letter from her sister in Berlin. The envelope was thin, the paper poor quality, the handwriting cramped to fit as much as possible onto limited space. Her sister wrote about life in the city after years of war, the bombing, the shortages, the fear that permeated daily existence. Helene, I hope this letter finds you safe. Berlin is not the city you remember. The bombing continues almost nightly. Our neighborhood is mostly rubble. Food is scarce. We eat whatever we can find. Father's health is poor, but there's little medicine available. I pray the war ends soon, though no one speaks of this openly. The letter continued with careful words about conditions in Germany, avoiding anything that might be censored, but still conveying the desperation of civilian life under a collapsing regime. Helene read the letter 3 times, then sat in the barracks that evening, comparing her situation to her sister's. She was a prisoner in enemy territory, had lost her freedom, faced an uncertain future. But she ate regular meals. She slept in a bed with blankets. She worked, but wasn't overworked. She'd received kindness from guards, who had every reason to treat her harshly. Her sister was free, but lived in constant danger, surrounded by destruction, struggling to survive on inadequate rations, while bombs fell around her. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Helene was safer as an enemy prisoner in Texas than her family was as civilians in Germany. The implications were staggering. As winter gave way to spring, temperatures moderated and work assignments shifted. The women were assigned to agricultural labor helping with planting in fields near the camp, working alongside civilian contractors and other prisoners. Morrison supervised some of these assignments, ensuring prisoners and civilians maintained appropriate working relationships. One afternoon in March, Morrison brought lemonade to the field where women were planting vegetable gardens that would supply the camp kitchen. He distributed cups, making sure everyone got their share, speaking in his slow English that the women were gradually learning to understand better. Helene was planting tomato seedlings when he approached with her cup. She accepted it with a thank you that came more naturally now after weeks of practice. Morrison nodded, started to move on, then paused. "How's your sister?" he asked. Helene looked up, surprised. She'd mentioned her sister once in passing during a work assignment, hadn't expected Morrison to remember. "In Berlin. Not good. Very difficult there." Morrison nodded slowly. "War is hard on everyone. Hope it ends soon so folks can go home." It was a simple statement, but it carried implications that struck Helene forcefully. Morrison didn't see victory or defeat in ideological terms. He saw war as something that needed to end so people could return to normal life. His sons were fighting overseas. Helene's sister was surviving bombing in Berlin. Both were suffering, and Morrison seemed to recognize that suffering transcended which side you were on. For the first time since capture, Helene felt something that might have been hope, not for German victory, which seemed increasingly unlikely, but for a future where war ended and people could rebuild lives from whatever remained. May brought news that Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The regime had collapsed completely, leadership scattered or captured, the military defeated on all fronts. In Camp Swift, the announcement created complex emotions. Relief that fighting had ended, anxiety about what came next, grief for a Germany that now existed only in ruins, and for some, like Helene, a recognition that the propaganda they'd believed had been thoroughly, catastrophically wrong. American guards celebrated the victory cautiously, aware that prisoners were watching, but unable to completely suppress their relief that the war they'd been preparing to fight was over. Morrison didn't celebrate visibly. He simply continued his duties, maintaining the same steady presence he'd shown throughout. The prisoners gathered in the barracks that evening, processing the news. Some cried for lost family, for destroyed homeland, for years wasted supporting a regime that had led them to this point. Others felt numb, unable to generate emotion for an outcome they'd been quietly expecting for months. Helene thought about Morrison's jacket, about the warmth he'd shared on that freezing January morning. That gesture had been a small act of kindness, easily dismissed as insignificant. But it had represented something larger, the possibility that enemies could recognize each other as humanity even while at war. That compassion could exist alongside conflict. That the categories propaganda created could be transcended through simple acts of decency. Summer 1945 brought discussions of repatriation. With the war over, German prisoners would be returned home to help rebuild their devastated country. The process would take months processing paperwork, arranging transportation, coordinating with occupation authorities in Germany. For many prisoners, the prospect of returning was mixed with dread. Germany was in ruins, millions displaced, food scarce, infrastructure destroyed. What kind of home awaited them? Helene received another letter from her sister in June. Berlin was under Allied occupation, divided into sectors. Her father had died in April heart failure, though the letter suggested it was really exhaustion and malnutrition and despair combined. Their mother was alive but struggling. The apartment where they'd grown up had been destroyed. They were living in a basement with 3 other families. Come home if you can, Helene. We need you, but I won't lie, things are very hard here. Harder than I can explain in a letter. Helene showed the letter to Anna, who read it with the same expression of grief and resignation. Anna's family situation was similar: father dead, mother surviving barely, hometown occupied and partially destroyed. We have to go back, Anna said. They need us. Germany needs every person who can work to rebuild. Helene nodded, but she found herself reluctant to leave, not because captivity had been pleasant, but because she found something unexpected here, evidence that propaganda had been wrong, that former enemies could become something like acquaintances, if not friends, that a cowboy in Texas could show more humanity than her own government had. September 1945. Helene and 31 other women from Camp Swift were scheduled for repatriation. They would board trains to the East Coast, then ships to Germany, and whatever transportation existed in occupied territory to reach their hometowns. The morning they departed, Morrison was on duty. He'd been assigned to help oversee the transfer-ensuring prisoners boarded trucks that would take them to the train station, that no one was left behind or lost in the confusion. Helene found him near the gate, supervising the loading process. She approached with Anna beside her, both carrying small bags containing their few possessions letters from home. A change of clothes, personal items accumulated during months in captivity. Mr. Morrison, Helene said, her English much improved from January, when she could barely speak. I want to thank you. Morrison removed his hat, holding it in weathered hands. For what? For the jacket. For showing kindness when you didn't have to. For treating us like human beings instead of enemies. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You are always human beings. War made us enemies, but that doesn't change what we are underneath. Helene felt tears threatening. She'd cried very little during captivity, maintaining composure through uncertainty and hardship. But this moment saying goodbye to a man who'd shown unexpected compassion broke something loose inside her. I will remember, she said, always, what you did. Morrison nodded. Take care of yourself. Help rebuild your country. Make it better than what came before. They shook hands, a formal gesture that felt inadequate, but was all the circumstances allowed. Then Helene boarded the truck with the other women, and Camp Swift disappeared behind dust kicked up by wheels on dirt roads. Helene returned to Berlin in October 1945, found her mother and sister living in conditions that made Camp Swift seem luxurious by comparison. She worked reconstruction jobs, clearing rubble, rebuilding structures, helping establish administrative systems in the occupied sector. The work was endless, the progress slow, the challenges overwhelming. But she carried Morrison's gesture with her proof that hatred wasn't inevitable, that former enemies could recognize each other's humanity, that small acts of kindness mattered even in large-scale catastrophes. She married in 1948, A man who'd been wounded on the Eastern Front and had his own stories of unexpected compassion from Soviet soldiers during captivity. They had 3 children, raised them in a Germany struggling to come to terms with what the regime had done, what ordinary people had supported or tolerated. She told her children about the cowboy who'd given his jacket to a freezing prisoner, about the moment the camp went silent, about learning that propaganda's depictions of enemies were fundamentally false. She told them this not to excuse German actions. The regime's atrocities couldn't be excused, but to illustrate that even in war, human decency remained possible. Morrison continued working as a guard at Camp Swift until the camp closed in 1946. He returned to ranch work, eventually retired in the 1950s. His sons both survived the war. One returned from the Pacific in 1945, the other from Europe in 1946. Morrison died in 1967. His obituary mentioning his ranch work and his service during the war, but not detailing the hundreds of small kindnesses he'd shown to people who been classified as enemies. The sheepskin jacket Morrison wore that January morning lasted him another 20 years. He wore it working cattle during winter months, wore it checking fence lines during storms, wore it on cold mornings when Texas weather turned harsh. The jacket became part of his routine, a tool as essential as rope or saddle. He never mentioned the day he'd given it to a German prisoner, never told the story in bars or at community gatherings. To him, it was too unremarkable to merit telling he'd seen someone cold, had shared warmth, had received the jacket back at day's end. Simple transaction, nothing heroic about it. But for Helene and the 31 other women who'd witnessed that moment, the gesture carried weight that Morrison never recognized. It had been proof that propaganda could be wrong, that enemies could show compassion, that the categories war created could be transcended through acts as simple as sharing a coat. The jacket itself eventually wore out leather cracked, wool compressed, seams splitting from decades of use. Morrison replaced it with a newer model in the 1960s, the old jacket consigned to a barn where it gathered dust alongside other obsolete equipment. When Morrison died, his son cleaned out the ranch house and barn. He found the old jacket among items scheduled for disposal. Something about it, the worn leather, the compressed wool, the evidence of long use, made him hesitate. He kept it, storing it in his own barn, though he didn't know its full history. The silence that fell over Camp Swift that January morning lasted perhaps 10 seconds. 10 seconds when all activity stopped, when guards and prisoners and administrative personnel all paused to witness something unexpected. Civilian guard removing his expensive jacket and draping it across the shoulders of a freezing enemy prisoner. 10 seconds seems insignificant measured against years of war, millions of casualties, entire nations transformed by conflict. But those 10 seconds represented something that larger events often obscured: possibility that individuals could choose compassion over hatred, that basic human decency could persist even in circumstances designed to eliminate it. The silence ended when Lieutenant Hayes spoke. When the camp returned to its routines, when war's machinery continued grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. But something had changed in that moment, something that affected how prisoners understood their captors, how guards understood their duties, how everyone involved recognized that the categories war imposed friend and enemy, victor and vanquished, were more flexible than propaganda suggested. Years later, when Helene told her grandchildren about the cowboy and the jacket, they asked why the camp had gone silent. She struggled to explain it to children who'd grown up in peacetime, who'd never experienced the rigid divisions war created. Finally, she said, the silence was recognition. Everyone watching understood they were seeing something that shouldn't happen according to war's rules, but which represented how humans should treat each other regardless of circumstance. The silence was acknowledging that gap between what war demanded and what human decency required. Camp Swift closed in 1946, its barracks demolished or repurposed, its fences removed, its guard towers taken down. The land returned to agricultural use, as if the camp had never existed. But the memories persisted, in letters sent home by prisoners, in stories told by guards, in official records documenting the processing of thousands of enemy prisoners through Texas detention facilities. Among those records, there's no mention of Morrison giving his jacket to Helene Richter on a freezing January morning. It wasn't the kind of event that merited documentation. No regulations were violated beyond Lieutenant Hayes's momentary concern about fraternization. No security breaches occurred. Nothing newsworthy happened. But the moment mattered more than most events that were officially recorded. It mattered because it represented a fundamental truth that war tries to obscure and underneath uniforms and national identities and ideological commitments, people remain people, capable of recognizing each other's suffering and choosing to alleviate it. The Texas wind still blows across land where Camp Swift once stood. The cold fronts still sweep down from Canada, bringing temperatures that feel punishing to those unprepared. And somewhere in archives and memories, the story remains of a cowboy who gave his jacket to an enemy prisoner, and in doing so, created a moment of silence that acknowledged something more important than any war's objectives. Helene Richter died in 2002, survived by 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and multiple great-grandchildren. In her papers, found after her death, was a journal entry from January 15, 1945, describing a freezing morning in Texas and an unexpected act of kindness that changed her understanding of what humans owed each other. Her daughter donated the journal to a museum documenting German-American relations during and after the war. It sits now in climate-controlled storage, available to researchers studying how propaganda dissolves when confronted with human decency, how enemies become neighbors, how simple acts of compassion can matter more than grand gestures. And in that journal, in handwriting that time has faded but not erased, are words that capture what Morrison's gesture meant. Today I learned that war's categories are temporary, but human kindness transcends all boundaries. A man I was taught to hate showed me more compassion than my own government ever did. I will carry this lesson for the rest of my life and teach it to anyone who will listen. The camp is gone. The jacket wore out. Morrison died decades ago. But the silence that fell over Camp Swift that January morning still echoes, a reminder that even in circumstances designed to divide humanity into warring factions, individuals can choose connection over enmity warmth, over cold kindness, over the hatred that war demands.